Many of you have probably heard of TED Talks. You can find videos online of smart and engaging people describing ideas worth spreading, which is their slogan. They not only cover technology, entertainment, and design, which is what TED stands for, but a world of other topics. There's even a TED radio hour on NPR based on the talks. TED sponsors fascinating lectures and awards prizes to people with promising ideas. 12 years ago, the author of this morning's second reading, Karen Armstrong, received the TED Prize and used it to help create, launch, and promote a Charter for Compassion. The charter was unveiled the following year, and the year after that, in 2010, her book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life, was published. If you don't already have the book, I imagine you can borrow it from the library or from a friend. It's floating around in UU circles. You can read the charter itself at charterforcompassion.org. An organization was also formed, Charter for Compassion International, and according to their website, they work to establish and sustain cultures of compassion locally and globally through diverse initiatives: education, cities, business, religious and spiritual communities, and the arts. We supply resources, information, and communication platforms to help create and support compassionate communities, institutions, and networks of all types that are dedicated to becoming compassionate presences in the world. Over 70 cities throughout the world have affirmed the Charter for Compassion through city, community councils, or other government entities. Affirming the Charter means that a community has identified issues on which they are working and committed to a multi-year action plan. Some of the participating cities in Texas include Austin, Dallas, and Houston. Working to make ourselves and our world more compassionate is wonderful. But let's stop a minute before we get ahead of ourselves. What are all these people actually advocating? Why does our UU second principle promote justice, equity, and compassion in human relations? What exactly is compassion, and how does it differ from sympathy or empathy? Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh views compassion as the intention and capacity to relieve and transform suffering and lighten sorrows. Psychotherapist and writer David Richo tells us that compassion is love's response to pain. So, why do we send sympathy cards when someone dies and not a compassion card? So let's break it down a little bit. When we feel sympathy, we feel sorry for someone else's hurt or pain. There's some emotional distance, but we're able to understand what the person is feeling. We can imagine why someone is going through a hard time or why they might be feeling happy or sad. In the case of sending the sympathy card, we understand why they are grieving because someone important to them passed away, even though we aren't personally experiencing the same grief. So sympathy is a bit more in our head, but empathy is a bit more in our heart. Empathy is viscerally feeling what another feels. In fact, researchers have identified what they call mirror neurons that prompt empathy to arise automatically when we see someone else in pain. We're able to experience for ourselves some of the pain the other person is experiencing. According to one website, empathy is a vicarious experience. If your friend is feeling afraid, you too will experience a feeling of fear in your body. If they're sad, you too will feel sorrow. Feeling empathy is allowing yourself to become tuned into another person's emotional experience. It takes courage to do this. But if you have ever experienced real empathy from another when you have been hurting, you will know what a gift it can be. Sympathy is the ability to recognize that a person is in pain, and empathy is the ability to really experience some of their feelings. But compassion takes these further. It compels us to put those thoughts and feelings into action, to actually do our best to alleviate the person's suffering. Compassion is love's response to pain. So let's say your good friend's mom is in the hospital. You can see how stressed and worried they are. You remember how frazzled you were when your dad was in the hospital. You cook some dinners and take them to your friend. You pick up their kids from school or take them for the evening so your friend has less to worry about. You put your thoughts and feelings into action. You're showing compassion. On a national level, you've probably heard of, or even expressed yourself, frustration with those who offer thoughts and prayers, but don't let those propel them to any action. We as persons and we as a society need to use our sympathy and empathy to propel us to action. Many of you are familiar with Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan in the New Testament book of Luke. Although it's reported that Jews and Samaritans despised one another, the Samaritan stops to help a man who is beaten and robbed alongside the road. He not only binds his wounds, he takes the man to an inn to be cared for. And since the man didn't have insurance, and this was before GoFundMe pages, he pays for that care. He actually tangibly does several things to help the man. Well, I noticed something interesting when I went back to review this story. Technology allows us to look at various translations with just a click online these days. The King James Version reads, "But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him." While the New Revised Standard Version reads, "But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity." We've talked about the differences between sympathy, empathy, and compassion, but where does pity fit in? Well, pity can be a bit more problematic in my estimation. The downside of pity is that we may be seeing the person as less than, perhaps even responsible for their own suffering, rather than as people quite like us who happen to be going through a rough patch or painful events. Viewing someone with pity rather than compassion may lead us to contribute to their suffering rather than to help alleviate it. I would argue that the priest and the Levite who passed on the other side of the road may have pitied the man, wondering what he did to deserve such a fate, while the Samaritan didn't judge the man, but showed compassion, not pity, by helping the man. Compassion is love's response to pain. But what if the priest and the Levite didn't even pity the man, couldn't be bothered? Some have argued that indifference, just as much as hate, is the opposite of love. If compassion is love's response to pain, the priest and Levite's indifference was just as unhelpful to the man as hate. Sadly, pity may be a more comfortable spot for us than compassion or even empathy. Because if we can distance ourselves from the person in pain, we can pretend that something similar will never happen to us. As I said earlier, it takes courage to allow yourself to become tuned into another person's emotional experience. It's easier to walk on the other side of the road because we're frightened that these things may happen to us, whether we admit it or not. In a 2002 PBS Now interview, Karen Armstrong told Bill Moyers, Compassion is not a popular virtue. Very often when I talk to religious people and mention how important it is that compassion is the key, that it's an essential condition of religion, people look kind of balked and stubborn sometimes, as much to say, oh, what's the point of having religion if you can't disapprove of other people? And sometimes we use religion just to back up these unworthy hatreds because we're frightened too. I considered a lot of compelling selections as I was looking for readings about this month's theme, compassion. As it happened, the two I decided upon are both by women, which is appropriate during this Women's History Month. And both of the readings describe religion from a less typical angle, how religion can intersect with compassion so we can use them to transform our lives and the lives of others for the better. Religion often gets a bad rap, and sometimes deservedly so. In seminary, I read a lot of church history about how religion has been misused over the centuries to wield power over others rather than help them. Here in Texas, and on today's political stage, it's easy to imagine those who might say, what's the point of having religion if you can't disapprove of other people? But as we heard in our reading by Sarah Gibb Millspaw, religion at its best asks us to do better than this, to rise above the selfishness and status seeking, to the othering and xenophobia that comes so easily to us. Religion at its best, and our Unitarian Universalist faith, calls us to honor that which is sacred in each person, even those we might hate, even those who we might find disgusting. It impels us to accept on faith that there is a sacred spark, a worthy spark in every person. If we look at its Latin roots, compassion means to suffer with. When we're compassionate, we're not judging others. We're not running away from them or their suffering due to fear. We're not pretending the suffering doesn't exist. When we practice compassion, we stay present with suffering. One of the things I learned as a hospital chaplain was the concept of a ministry of presence. Just being there, sitting beside someone who is going through something worse than anything they ever imagined they would have to go through. I said earlier that what makes compassion different than sympathy or empathy is that it compels us to put those thoughts and feelings into action. Perhaps counterintuitively, just sitting with someone in their pain is an important and meaningful action. But people feel so awkward, so flummoxed, so frightened to sit with someone going through such immense pain. We've all been there. We want to say something, anything to make it better. But those things usually come from our place of sympathy. Oh, I know just how you feel. Or, I had something similar happen to me back in the 80s. People don't want to hear that. It's not helpful. Believe me, I've tried it. They want you to be able to sit with them and tune into their pain, help carry their burden, do whatever we can to help alleviate their suffering, which is very difficult. Some of my best work as a chaplain, I was totally silent and just handed the suffering person tissues. Showing compassion can help us gain perspective because it puts us in someone else's shoes and makes us put time and thought into alleviating someone's suffering. We can all intentionally work toward living a more compassionate life. It's not reserved for the Good Samaritan, the Buddha, or the Dalai Lama. Not long after it was published, I helped facilitate a study group at the Dallas church that read Karen Armstrong's book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. In that book, she writes, while he was working toward enlightenment, the Buddha devised a meditation that made him conscious of the positive emotions of friendship, compassion, joy, and even-mindedness that lay dormant in his mind. He then directed this immeasurable love to the ends of the earth. Later, he would tell his monks to do the same. When your mind is filled with love, send it in one direction, then a second, and a third, and a fourth, then above, then below. Identify with everything without hatred, resentment, anger, or enmity. This mind of love is very wide. It grows immeasurably and eventually is able to embrace the whole world. Over time, the Buddha found that by constantly activating these positive psychological states, he became free of the constrictions of hostility and fear, and that his own mind expanded with the immeasurable power of love. So, we tried the immeasurable love meditation in our book study group. We began the first week directing those positive emotions of friendship, compassion, joy, and even-mindedness to someone who brought us joy and friendship. The next week, we did the same and added someone we knew by sight but had no strong feelings for one way or the other. The following week, we added someone we disliked, someone who got under our skin a little, but wasn't really a direct threat. You'll see this is getting progressively more difficult. So we repeated these 3 steps for a few weeks, trying to get the hang of them before we moved on. We then added someone who has done some act of kindness toward us. Then a nation, people, or religious person we knew little of. Then someone in our life who was in need, a person who was distressed or suffering. Then, finally, wait for it, someone we considered an enemy, a threat to our very way of life. Perhaps you can see how beginning with ourselves, working out in concentric circles to those we love, and then further, makes it a more concrete, doable goal. And perhaps more difficult, because it is no longer just an abstract concept. It is something we can attempt and really do. Now, these circles of compassion might seem a bit daunting, and rightly so. I recommend the book and the process, but until we get there, here's an easier to remember 4-step process to help us kickstart our lives of compassion. It's by the Dalai Lama's principal English translator, Thupten Jinpa. Number 1, awareness of suffering. Number 2, sympathetic concern related to being emotionally moved by suffering. 3, wish to see the relief of that suffering. 4, responsiveness or readiness to help relieve that suffering. Or in my words, slow down and pay attention to other people. Be vulnerable. Open yourself to be sympathetic and empathetic to these people. Then sincerely hope they get relief to their suffering. Then determine what you can do to help alleviate that suffering. As the 4 steps make clear, and in the words of Thich Nhat Hanh, we must practice mindfulness, deep listening, and deep looking to develop compassion. Compassion is a practice that involves Eastern wisdom and includes Western notions of feelings, thoughts, and emotions. We transcend suffering with practice to realize our common humanity. With practice, we learn to tend to our own suffering and to relieve the suffering of others. The Dalai Lama famously said in the book, The Art of Happiness, "If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion." May we join together and work each day towards a more compassionate city, country, and world. Amen.